Stephen. We really could not be having this event tonight without the work of Berkeley Business Society, so we're really honored to be in partnership with them for this event. Now, for the fun and exciting part and why you all came to this event, I'd now like to introduce our event moderator for this evening, Omatara Aloye.
Hello everyone, and thank you for attending tonight's session of the Berkeley Forum, a debate on breaking up big tech. The format of this event will be as follows. I will introduce each one of our speakers one by one, and they will present a brief 3-minute overview of their position. Following this, we will move into the moderated cross-examination stage. Our first speaker for tonight is Professor Jonathan Taplin. He is on the pro side, and therefore will be speaking in favor of breaking up big tech. Jonathan Taplin is a Director Emeritus of the USC Annenberg Innovation Lab and a former tour manager for Bob Dylan and the band, as well as a film producer for Martin Scorsese. An expert in digital media entertainment, Taplin is a member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences and sits on the California Broadband Task Force and Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti's Council on Technology and Innovation. He is also the author of Move Fast and Break Things: How Facebook, Google, and Amazon Have Cornered Culture and Undermined Democracy.
Thank you very much. I should say that my book did not advocate breaking up big tech, but there are two schools of thought about this. One represented by Justice Brandeis, which was you can't have competition because the government always ends up being regulated by the companies they're trying to regulate. So Brandeis's theory is you just have to break them up. The other theory was, no, you can regulate big tech. But over the last 3 years, Google and Facebook have paid almost $15 billion in fines, and neither of them have changed their behavior one bit. Both of them are running ads today that say, paid by the Trump campaign, that say that Joe Biden gave $1 billion to the Attorney General of Ukraine to stop investigating Trump. These are ads. Now, these ads would never be run by any cable thing at all, but they're on Facebook and YouTube. So I want to just acknowledge that we wouldn't be here today if there wasn't very strong antitrust enforcement. In 1956, long before most of you were born, we had a single monopoly phone company called AT&T, and the government forced it to enter into a consent decree in which all of its intellectual property owned by Bell Labs had to be licensed for free to any company in America. That included the transistor, the laser, the semiconductor, the satellite, the cellular system. And out of those free patents came Silicon Valley. Hewlett-Packard, Motorola, Texas Instruments, Fairchild Semiconductor, Intel. Those companies would not have existed if the federal government hadn't forced AT&T to license their patents for free. 20 years later, IBM was sued by the federal government because if you wanted to buy an IBM mainframe, you had to use the IBM software. And so IBM fought for 13 years to be able to keep bundling its hardware and software. And near the end of this thing, they decided that they were going to make a personal computer, and they said, this is too much hassle. We'll let these two young kids from Seattle, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, make the software, and we'll make the hardware because that's where all the money will be. That was a stupid move, but needless to say, 20 years later, if you bought a Microsoft operating system computer, you had to use Internet Explorer. Again, the government sued Microsoft to unbundle the hardware and the software, and the government won, and they're up rose Google. So I'll leave it at that.
Our first speaker for tonight will be Professor Hemant Bhargava. Professor Bhargava Professional and research interests center around technology, analytics, and platforms. He is particularly interested, among other things, in competition and industry structure in the media and entertainment industries. His research on this and other topics appears in several academic journals and conferences, and in the general media. He has provided professional leadership through editorial positions at top journals and co-founding the TEIS annual workshop. At UC Davis, he has served as Associate Dean and launched the master's program in business analytics.
All right, thank you. And thanks to you all for being here and flying with us on Tuesday evening. I would also like to thank the organizers for creating this great event and putting us all together. And I'm sure Jonathan and Jessica will wow you with some interesting examples, and there's a lot of emotion and sentiments of outrage against the big technology companies. But I think there's a lot more to the story, and I would love to come back to the three examples John cited about AT&T, IBM, and Microsoft. But let me start by really discussing what is not on the table here, right? So being big by itself, or making products that might be considered bad or harmful if you use them too much, is really not something that antitrust regulation is about. Nor is it the fact that these companies may collect a lot of your data, or even to some extent serve to moderate data exchange between multiple players. And that's sort of the issue that about advertising on Facebook and Google. What really is on the table, and alluding to John's background in rock and roll, I would like to give you the Bhargava principle, right? With the B being that these companies have to be big, powerful, and dominant. The A being there needs to be abuse of dominance, right? And we can talk about examples of that, and I would think that really isn't a strong case. And the C edge is that there should be consumer harm, right? And the third one is sort of the easiest one to talk about, because if you look at Google or Facebook, or even the components of Google, the search engine, Android, YouTube, these are all products, first of all, that did not exist 20 years ago. So it would be very hard to say there was consumer harm due to higher prices, right? Or due to poor quality products. They are just wonderful tools that we all love to use every day. But secondly, they're all free. And how do you establish consumer harm due to higher prices when people are using these free products billions of times a day? And it's not just the fact that they're free. There's actually a really interesting paper in April 2019, this year, in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which reports a bunch of choice experiments, and you can read those details in the paper. But they were basically trying to establish what is the value to a user of Facebook or Google and so forth. And the numbers were astounding. If you collect all of those together, the amount of economic surplus that these companies are creating in favor of consumers is just incredible, right? And to give you an example, if you were asked to give up email entirely for a year, the median value that was quoted for that was $8,000, right? And they all use email essentially for free. So if you look at the fundamental principles of antitrust, the big abuse of dominance and consumer harm, that's really not quite visible to me.
You could just have me scoot people like here so that people can hear in the back as well. That'd be cool. Our second pro speaker for the night will be Miss Jessica Powell. Jessica Powell was formerly Vice President of Communications for Google and served on the company's management team. Her novel, The Big Disruption, a totally fictional but essentially true Silicon Valley story, was the first ever book published by Medium and has been read by hundreds of thousands of people. Her work has been published in the New York Times, The Guardian, Wired, Fast Company, and Medium Magazine. She is also the co-founder of a startup that builds music software. She will be speaking in favor of breaking up big tech.
Hi, I actually didn't know I was speaking in favor of breaking up big tech. Like Jonathan, my book is nothing about regulation. It's more like about engineers like trying to run the world while having lots of sex with their employees and drinking kombucha. And there's really no reference to dominance. But I do have, so I don't actually have a super strong opinion on whether or not big tech should be broken up. I do have a very strong opinion on the debate around the breakup though, which I think on the whole tends to conflate concerns about privacy, concerns about speech and what should be allowed on platforms, and then sometimes vague notions of dominance. And that people are not always clear on what they want to get out of this. In fact, the majority of, say, the media attention tends to focus much more on privacy and speech lately than it does actually on definitions of dominance and competition. Which is not to say that I'd be against big tech being broken up. But on the whole, I think I'm very interested in more selective or specific regulation that looks to address very specific harms, because I don't think the industry is as shiny as it likes to project. I think we have real issues around privacy, particularly compared to other parts of the world. I think there's a real debate to be had around innovation and competition, as much around how you encourage it as what you don't want to do if you want to see it flourish. And I think there are some dangers and potential unintended consequences of some of the proposals that have been made around acquisitions in particular were actually to happen. I'm sure we'll get into that, so I'll talk further. And having said all that, I entirely reserve the option to completely switch my mind by the end of the debate, because I think I'm a little bit more right here in the whole thing. I'm not 100% in favor of tech, though certainly not all against it either.
Thank you. And finally, our second con speaker for tonight will be Professor Richard Gilbert. Richard J. Gilbert is an economist who served as Deputy Assistant General in the Antitrust Division of the United States Department of Justice in the White House from 1993 to 1995, and author of Innovation Matters, Competition Policy for the Knowledge Economy. While at the Justice Department, Professor Gilbert facilitated the development of the Joint Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission antitrust guidelines for the licensing of intellectual property. Professor Gilbert has taken special interest in telecom, media marketing, entertainment, music, sports, and energy economics. He will be speaking against breaking up big tech.
Thanks very much. I guess you can hear it. Yeah, that's on. And thank you very much for the invitation to be on the Berkeley Forum panel here with this great and diverse group. Looking forward to the debate. So I will discuss the issue of breaking up tech from an antitrust perspective, since that's mainly what I do. I hope we will get to talk about all the other issues as well, but I'm not meaning to suggest that they are unimportant by any means. But if we look at divestiture from an antitrust perspective, there are a number of steps you have to go through. First, you have to ask, what is the purpose of the divestiture? What are you trying to accomplish? It could be that you have a regulated industry that has been foreclosing competition, as in the AT&T breakup. We don't have that here. You could be trying to restore lost competition in ways that are not addressable with milder conditions. That's often the case in merger-related divestitures. Or you're just trying to send a message, really punish somebody for persistent abuses, and hopefully that will have a deterrent value. The problem there is we want to make sure that the punishment doesn't, and that really vigilant, assertive, aggressive antitrust enforcement is absolutely necessary. And it's not my view that these platforms haven't done anything bad. I think there have been a number of issues that should be challenged. I also don't subscribe to the view that just because you don't pay a monetary price to search, although you are paying with your data, which is a big price, they're buying you, that just because you don't pay a monetary price, there can be no harm on that side of the market. There certainly can be harm on that side of the market through quality, foreclosure, all kinds of issues. The problem really comes down to what's a remedy. What are you going to do about this stuff? So a good example, certainly ties to the discussion, is there was this investigation of Google's conduct with regard to product search. So when you typed in a search query for shoes or something like that, up would pop some advertisements for shoes. And Google did an update to its algorithms, so-called Panda update after Mr. Panda. I thought it was named after the animal, but it's actually the engineer who did it. And what happened with this update is it did two things. One is that it displayed Google's own product features prominently on the top search engine results page. And it also demoted some competing search products. Now, product search websites. Now, this was investigated by the FTC and by the European Commission. Disclosure, I consulted from the FTC in the investigation. The FTC decided not to do anything.
Though the staff one was too simple.
Not true, actually. That's a mis...
Wall Street Journal was wrong.
Yeah, they always the staff never recommended action on this issue. It was something else. The European Commission imposed a remedy. And that was almost 3 years ago. They're still arguing about the remedy and how it's going to work. It's just a very hard thing to remedy. I don't think either approach, either by the FTC or by the European Commission, has gotten this right. Because the real issue was, did Google design its search algorithms in a way to really suppress the competition, or did they have good reasons for the design? They claimed they had good reasons for it, but no one really looked into it. In fact, the European Commission actually assertively said, we're not looking into this. This isn't our business. What the European Commission wanted Google to do was to be a public utility that provided service that treated everybody the same, and if Google had a product, everybody else's product would be up there. Well, there's a problem. There's only one page, and the page isn't that big when you type in a search query. How do you put everything on the same page? So there are just some physical problems with how do you structure a remedy and what's the right thing to do. And that I think is the really hard thing about this.
So in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the next question so we can hit on as many topics as possible. And many of you have already started to touch upon this on some of your answers. But how, if at all, does the breaking up of large and popular tech companies affect the quality and usage of these products and the services that they offer? And we'll be starting with Professor Gilbert.
Well, you have this problem called network effects. People tend to go where other people go. And you can break up Facebook into mini Facebook. I'm afraid that what's going to happen is that there will then emerge eventually a dominant platform. So what have you accomplished? I wish that Facebook didn't acquire Instagram, but I'm not sure that we would have really been better off, because then Facebook still would have introduced its video sharing app, and then you'd have a problem with network effects driving people to Facebook. So there are forces in the economy that make breaking up difficult as a really lasting remedy that's going to work. And that's the problem. That if you want to do something and have intervention, you need to make sure you're going to make the world better and it's going to work. And I don't really see a path to get to that end. Privacy is another issue, but I personally don't see how breaking up Facebook into a lot of little Facebooks is going to solve the privacy problem. In fact, it could make it worse, because the little Facebooks can compete by in fact having even worse privacy policies. Maybe they'd be better, maybe they'd be worse. It's not clear.
Sure. I mean, I think I agree. If we look at phones, right? 15 years ago, if any of us had a smart-ish phone, it wouldn't have been Android, it wouldn't have been Apple, it would have been a BlackBerry, right? Competition actually does work in a lot of ways. Like Microsoft once made the dominant browser And then Chrome came along and it was so much faster. Now Chrome's getting run for their money by Firefox. So I think competition and preserving that is super important. But I also think, like Jonathan was saying, Snap is a really good example. Instagram, had it remained independent, are good examples where things do transform once they're acquired. I think it would be, I don't know how you would do it, but also silly to try and reverse acquisitions, as, like, say, Elizabeth Warren has proposed. But I do think it'd be interesting to look at ways to approach acquisitions going forward. Not so that, what people sometimes get wrong about acquisitions is they think that everything is like a Snap acquisition or an Instagram acquisition. The vast majority of acquisitions are super boring. It's like someone making emoji stickers and selling it to Google. Like hundreds of acquisitions happen every year, and they're very small acquisitions. And I think they actually generally promote a pretty healthy ecosystem in terms of VCs and entrepreneurship and so forth. But with the really big acquisitions, if there had been more barriers based on acquisitor size, based on that startup size, I think you could have seen more competition. Agree with you also on privacy. I don't think breakup addresses privacy explicitly, and so going into a breakup, even kind of hypothetical, thinking it's going to address that, I think is bound to fail. I think having specific privacy legislation is much more interesting. If it did happen, though, that there was a breakup, I don't think it would be disastrous for privacy in the sense that if you then have, which is very, very likely, that we're going to have a European-style GDPR, which is just much, much heavier, let's say, privacy regulation. If there was, I think, a leveling of sorts where you had a bunch of more medium-sized companies, in some ways that's kind of a good thing, because one of the problems with GDPR is that really only the big tech companies have been able to grapple with it because they're the only ones with the resources. So if all of a sudden you were dealing with medium-sized companies, perhaps that would also push for the legislation to be something that was attainable and was taking size into account. So I don't think it would be disastrous for privacy, but I agree that if the goal is privacy, then that does not lead you to an antitrust kind of course of action.
All right, yeah, so just to start with privacy, I think we can put that aside. We definitely need new good privacy legislation. We have GDPR in Europe, we have the new California Privacy Act, and all of that just has to be worked on, but it really has very little to do with antitrust. And I think what we're missing here is something very fundamental that, when we look at these issues of breaking up companies based on anti-competitive practices, these are regulations that were pretty much all written over 100 years ago, right? From the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, and then variations of that over time, and they're really, really ill-suited to today's world, where we see fundamental changes every 10 years or so. I mean, think of what smartphones have done in our lives in terms of mobility, and they've enabled things like Uber. We simply, that's just 15 years ago, and then before that you can think and just go back to the internet, desktop revolution, computing, and so forth. And that enormous change that occurs, what that has meant is that the companies that got the new technology early, I think we're actually the Davids that slayed the giants at the time, right? So Google is just over 20 years old, Amazon is 20 years old. And if you ask about why Google and Amazon are so powerful today, I would ask back, why not did Kmart or Sears or Macy's used information technologies to improve retail commerce? And they failed to do that. And we cannot simply penalize the winners because they were successful and were able to grasp the implications of these new technologies, create new business models. So all of these companies that we are talking about operate fundamentally in a very different way. Richard talked about network effects. They're all leveraging network effects. They're building these multi-sided marketplaces, which were simply not the norm even 15 years ago. And so I agree with the idea that we need to rethink some of these issues. That I think none of us here is saying that all the big tech companies do everything right. Something needs to change, but we need to analyze and rethink very deeply. And many of the effects of these potential new legislations can be quite counterintuitive. If you, for instance, break up some of these companies, the smaller units may compete so much more fiercely that we actually all have to sacrifice privacy. They go after it so much stronger. Platform business models also survive on this idea that the platform is only successful if it can share revenues and profits with its business partners. So if Amazon were to go and squeeze out every other seller who sells on Amazon, right? For instance, like Jessica mentioned the example of batteries, where Amazon saw such huge margins that they decided to offer their own batteries. And that again is a good thing for consumers, because if you have a product where someone is making such huge margins, that another company that never made batteries before could offer it at a cheaper price, we're all better off, right? But in general, if Amazon were to try to squeeze out every supplier, it would lose its biggest revenue source, which is the commissions it earns when XYZ seller sells me a product on Amazon. Right. So these are fundamentally different ways of operating, for which we do need to rethink legislation. But we cannot simply say that, given that we do not like something about these companies, that they're big, they're powerful, they earn massive profits, that they necessarily must be broken up. That's simply not a solution. And I think, as Richard said at the start, we don't really know what the problem is.
So, Richard suggested that remedies are hard. So I'm going to just dive in here and suggest remedies. Google. Google sells YouTube because Google was losing in the advertising space until YouTube began to really rise in the advertising space, because brand advertisers wanted video, and YouTube became the thing that rescued all of Google's. So split those two companies. Google, like AT&T, license all your IP for free to any American competitor. So autonomous car patents, Nest patents, search algorithm patents, advertising patents. Because let's assume Google is a natural monopoly in search. If I asked everybody in this room, I want you to invest in a new search engine that I'm going to start to go and compete with Google, you would all head for the exit. Nobody's going to be that stupid. Bill Gates lost $3 billion trying to compete against Google in search. Facebook. Sell Instagram, sell WhatsApp. So now you have 3 social networks competing, and my guess is that one of them would compete on quality and privacy. Would give you better privacy settings than Facebook does, and wouldn't have all the baggage that Facebook has in terms of politics, selling, lying, advertising to President Trump, whatever. Amazon is a trickier one, but you raise an interesting point. There was a company called diapers.com. Had a really innovative diaper product, began to sell it on Amazon. Amazon realized, man, there's a big demand for this product online. So first Amazon introduced their own white label product, drove down the market share that diapers.com, and needless to say, Amazon knew where all the customers was, had all the data. Diapers.com had none of the data. And then eventually, as Diapers.com was falling, Amazon said, we'll buy it. And it was classic John D. Rockefeller, let's sweat them a little bit, as they used to say, and then we'll buy them. So Amazon has to decide which side of the market you want to be in. Because as anybody who's in the book business knows, Amazon is a monopsonist. It is the single most important seller for any book seller in the world. And if Amazon wants you as a publisher to lower your prices, you bloody well have to do it, or you're in trouble. And when a few publishers like Hachette tried to fight that, it just shut them off the platform completely. You couldn't find a book from Hachette or Little Brown. So, they're muscles. And, last week in Seattle, they tried to buy the election. So let's not pretend these companies aren't just looking out for themselves. They're not this kind of, la-di-da, beautiful, we're just helping the world, don't be evil. It's a total PR lie. And you, as someone once said, you know, you're not paying for it, you're the product. Every one of you. And you know, Tim Berners-Lee, who's a friend of mine, who invented the World Wide Web, is spending the last 5 years of his life trying to invent a way that you can own your data and only give it out when you think you actually are going to gain some monetary advantage, like some airline's going to give you a real discount for giving them some data. And maybe he's going to perfect that. And maybe that will change things. But the point is, remedies are not hard. And it can be done. And quite frankly, I've come to the point of view that these companies do have to be smaller.
Unfortunately, for the sake of time, this is going to be my last question before we open up questions to the audience. Many of the technical infrastructure of the internet is built and supported by large tech companies, including cloud computing services such as Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure. What, if any, would be the implications of breaking up these technologies, of these companies and their technologies, on the stability of this infrastructure? And we'll be starting with Ms. Jessica.
Only for that and entirely for self-serving purposes, because I run a startup that uses AWS and TensorFlow and is incredibly expensive. I'd like them to be broken up so that I could afford microservices. I mean, it's, look, on the one hand, I'll actually, just entirely from like a founder point of view, like someone that uses this every single day, so I'll put aside like my Google past. The fact that these services exist is wonderful and extraordinary. The amount of money that so we do stuff in AI, the amount of computing power, the amount of like machines that we would have had to invest in to be able to get our thing off the ground, like it would have been, not necessarily a non-starter, but I would have had to go and raise so much capital from VCs to be able to do it, that like it actually in some ways then changes the barriers to entry also, right? So who has the VC connections and how can you get the funding, so on and so forth. So I actually think the availability of these platforms has lowered the barriers to entry for entrepreneurs. Probably some of you in this room, or certainly like lots of people at Berkeley, are doing the same thing. At the same time, they're incredibly expensive. There is not enough competition, so you really don't have that much choice. There isn't a lot of transparency around pricing. I won't get too technical on it, but depending on how you're running everything, you end up doing all these different kind of shortcuts to save money, and there's no way to actually kind of estimate sometimes how much you're going to spend. Probably all this will get a bit fixed with time, but you also see, if you are in a space where you're doing research that you know the big companies are undertaking, they can move so much faster than you just by dint of having that much computing power. And so that is a little bit worrisome, is that you are outgunned before you even started. And that then factors into your calculation of, am I doing research in this field, am I going research in this field? And also this is like adjacent to what you were asking, but it also plays out in VC and funding, where when the conversations you go to have when you're looking for funding now compared to say 5 years ago, a lot of conversations actually start with, or are very in that initial conversation, they touch on what is the likelihood of you being an acquisition target and what's your exit strategy. Versus 5 years ago, there was a lot more of how do you take this to be like, how do you take it to IPO or some other kind of event. And now there's very much a, look, there are 4 or 5 people that could acquire you, what's the likelihood of them acquiring you? Which just from an entrepreneur standpoint, that's still a good exit, you're happy about it, but that's a little grim when you're like kind of dreaming of, you know, the big fluffy dreams that Jonathan's saying you shouldn't have. But yeah.
All right, so I'm not sure when you talk about breaking up these cloud computing services, whether you meant separating the cloud computing unit from the rest of the company, for instance, with Amazon, or whether you want to break up for instance, the Amazon cloud computing unit into multiple parts. But let me try to address both of those, and I think the answer is sort of very similar for both, which is that at this point we have multiple cloud service providers, and there is a substantial amount of competition. And you know, these are industries which are naturally designed. I think we heard the word natural monopolists. We would use the phrase winner take all markets. These industries are designed so that only a handful of competitors will emerge at the end. But there's a myth around this idea that each of these firms tries to get big by discounting at the start. For instance, the example you gave about diapers. And then eventually it will start raising prices because it has become that powerful monopolist. And I will urge you to look at, after this event of course, search for the price of diapers, during diapers.com and today, and see how much inflation there has been in the price of diapers. And the reason there isn't much inflation is because in these industries, getting big and winning doesn't stop the game. They have to continuously do the same thing over and over again, keep innovating. So if you look at the 20 or so years of history of Amazon, the amount of innovations that have come out from this electronic commerce company that then became a marketplace, then started selling their own products, is quite amazing. And if they fail to do that, and if they simply try to reap the benefits of eating up a competitor and then make a lot of profits, they will actually not survive either. So that continuous innovation drives continuous benefits to consumers. And so if we break up these cloud companies, I really don't see the advantage, because those broken up pieces will compete and eventually coalesce into 2 or 3 or 4 major service providers. And they will, despite being only 2 or 3 or 4, fiercely compete to our benefit.
Okay, so let's state at the beginning that AI is going to be a world that's going to change your life. If any of you are, for instance, studying to be a radiologist, that's a job that's not going to exist in 10 years. I was at a law firm in Los Angeles last week, and they showed me their artificial intelligence case research system, and they said, used to take us 5 fresh out of law school kids in a library for 2 weeks to do what this system can do in 3 hours. So I said, well, what do you do with the 5 fresh out of law school kids? And he said, we don't hire them, we hire 1. And we put them in front of the computer and tell them not to touch anything, and maybe they'll learn something. The companies that dominate the web today, specifically Google and Amazon, will dominate AI for 3 simple reasons. Go talk to anybody who's in the engineering school, who's ready to graduate, who's interested in AI, and they'll tell you there's only 2 places you want to work: Google Cloud or Amazon Web Services. Because what is AI? It's nothing but muscle. If you want to teach a system facial recognition, what do you need? You need 20 million faces. Who's got that? Google's got it. And Amazon has got it from its customers. Even though you're using it, it still can use some of the learning. While it's helping you, it's also helping itself. So those 2 companies will end up being much more dominant in the society than they are now. 10 years ago, the largest companies in America were General Electric and Royal Dutch Shell and Exxon and companies like that. Today, the largest companies by market cap in the world are Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft. In 5 to 10 years, they will be even more dominant in society. And I just, we've had a little, I mentioned Brandeis, and he kind of taught Woodrow Wilson a little bit about antitrust. And Wilson said, once the government tries to regulate monopoly, then the monopoly will see to it that it regulates the government. Who's the largest lobbyist in Washington, D.C.? It's not Boeing, it's Google. The second largest lobbyist is Facebook. Why? Because they believe that they need to control the government in order to keep their lives alive. As Mark Zuckerberg said, someone like Elizabeth Warren is an existential threat to our company. So that's the game. And just be aware that we've been here before. We had to break up Standard Oil. We had to break up J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company. We had to break up trusts all through the history of this country. And it's only in the last 20 years when both the Democrats and the Republicans became so subservient to big money that we stopped doing that. We said the only thing that matters is consumer harm. In other words, the only thing that matters is whether prices go up or down. Well, that's not the only thing that matters.
Well, the link between AI and data is a fascinating one. I'm reluctant to predict the future, but I could see why data that's controlled by Google and Facebook could really be a game changer in that. By the way, maybe I feel my chair moving a little bit in this direction, but just I'm not against licensing of intellectual property. I think that there's a lot of good opportunities there. That's not the same as divestiture. I've done a number of studies of merger remedies, and I've seen a lot of positives come out from intellectual property licensing. The cloud companies, though, I find them curious. It seems obvious that they lower the entry barriers for someone who needs those services. You don't have to invest in all of those things. It's also obvious they're extremely data capital intensive. But what I don't get is that you've got Amazon, Google, and Microsoft both offering cloud services. And I don't see where the network effects are in this. They're platform independent services. There's no install base opportunism or anything like that going on. Someone offers a cheaper price, you go with that service. So I'm a little surprised why there isn't more competition in that sector, and maybe there will be.
It's just so capital intensive. I mean, I agree, but I don't think you would break that up.
Well, so there are a lot of capital intensive companies that manage to compete.
But then we have a separate, there's a whole conversation around chips and all kinds of other stuff too that comes into play. But yeah.
Thank you so much for answering my questions. We're now going to be moving on to audience questions. If you have something you'd like to ask, please raise your hand and I will call on you. Please keep your questions brief and please remember to speak up.
You said Google search is so good, so obviously people will not go for anything else. That's primarily because they have so much of personalization, they have so much data. So any smart company winning anywhere, a lot of them will never be able to compete with Google because there's so much data. So should companies like Google make their data set public, right? Give all your search data every 3 years so that other companies take that data with their algorithms, and maybe Google search would be PG&E, right? Because search is through which you can access every service today. Make it like something like PG&E.
Well, I think that's a little bit what Richard and I were both talking about, this possibility of a kind of more open licensing of their search algorithms, other things which they would have to let other people have access to. And that might mitigate some of the fact that, as you point out, no one is going to start a competitor to Google at this point. They're going to just own that.
Well, let me just take you back about 20 years, because Google was not the first search engine. And when Google started, there were well-established multiple search engines. There was Yahoo, Lycos, AltaVista, InfoSeek, all of which obviously, because Google was brand new, were better than Google. But what Google did was something very innovative. While everybody else was trying to build taxonomies and direct search, Google basically built a crowdsourced search engine, right? And the reason I'm telling you all this is if Google can start from zero and beat the 5 search engines that have 100% market share, why can we not rely on similar forces to beat Google tomorrow? And I think that's totally possible. And again, if you look at examples and say, well, now they're so big they can never be beaten. When Facebook started and Google saw that social media and other things were emerging, I hope some of you remember Google Wave, Google Plus, all of these products that Google started, and despite their enormous power, failed to beat this young upstart Facebook. And it's sort of we're going back into history, and many of you may not know these companies. So let me take you forward a little bit. How many of you would like to see electric vehicles, cars, dominate the future rather than gasoline automobiles? And you would all say yes, right? And the big challenge in creating more EVs today, or more adoption of EVs, is that you not only need to make a good car, and it's a little more expensive to do that, you also need to provide a supercharging network for those cars. And that's like search. So imagine 10 years from now, there's one company that invests and loses billions of dollars to create a supercharging network. So this is a great industry to take this example, because you have established companies, Audi, Daimler-Benz, BMW, Honda, Toyota, that are all making electric cars. But they're not losing billions of dollars by putting out a charging network. There's only one company that's doing that, right? Tesla. And they're losing money making cars, just like Amazon did not make profits for 15 years of its existence. And if 10 years from now, Tesla dominates supercharging, and we were to say, by the way, you need to open your charging network to everybody else to charge their cars, would they, from now onwards, invest and lose billions of dollars putting out a supercharging network? That's simply not the way competition works. And search is not what you call an essential facility. AT&T held an essential facility. They had telephone lines to every home, and you do not want 5 telephone lines running to every home. And so now and similarly, oil companies, mining companies, these companies are using natural resources. Search is not really a natural resource or a product that no one else can build just because you have built a better search product previously. And so to ask Google to open up all the data that they painstakingly collected over 20 years, and maybe even lost money at the start, but it's really changing the rules of the game after you've scored the goal. So I'm really not in favor of that.
Are there any other audience?
Can I just say one thing? Hemant, I'm going to say something a little snarky, and it's not meant as anything more than what it is. So you've all probably read the Wall Street Journal article that Google pays $200 million a year to academics to write papers in favor of Google. I assume Hemant is one of the recipients of this beneficence, and I assume when you write these things, you go to Google Shill School, which says competition is just a click away. This is their byword. That any minute, somebody's going to come and take over Google and beat them because they're going to provide a better search engine. Does anybody in this room actually believe that? No.
I think go back to 2007, we had Friendster and MySpace that had captured what looked like the full market for social media products at that time. And Facebook came out of nowhere, not as a social media product, not as a social platform, as something else. And this is the history of these platform companies. They migrate, they evolve from one piece product to another. And the reason they can do that is, unlike all the resources we have had in the past that have been used to make companies, information technology is a general purpose resource. And so you can be in one industry and start doing things with data and computing and quickly move on to an adjacent industry. And that's what allows Amazon to distribute books and then CDs and movies and diapers. And so I would not close my mind on the emergence of another search engine. And by the way, just to give you some data, in 2007, you could actually argue that Google was big, powerful, dominant as a search engine, because people did search on a computer using a web browser, all right? That changed starting 2007 with smartphones. Search was done on mobile, Facebook, Amazon. So in 2015, 55% of product searches, which is where a lot of the money is in advertising, started on Google. The remaining 45% were on Amazon. Today, in 2018, already 55% of product searches started on Amazon, not Google, all right? So if you're talking about Google as a search engine, by the way, Amazon is a search engine with a giant store behind it. Facebook is a search engine that uses data, preferences, recommendations from billions of users, right? So and this is the whole idea of general purpose technologies that cause market boundaries to be very ill-defined. I would argue Amazon is in the search engine space, and so is Facebook. And in fact, if you want a competitor to Google to emerge, you really do not want to weaken Amazon or Google or Facebook or Netflix, for instance, right? Because that's where the competition will emerge from. And perhaps from a completely brand new computer science graduate from Berkeley who might decide, just like Brin and Page did, in the 1990s, to come up with a completely different architecture for search. So it would not be built on the massive data set, that Google already has. It could be a completely innovative, different way to do search. And so I am not that pessimistic.
I'm just going to throw in one real quick thing, which is that I think, look, lethargy is a big issue. I know, sorry, competition's a push away. Sorry, yeah. But I used to say that a lot. And it is on a practical level, it totally is. But when Bing came out, Bing image search was way better than Google search, right? But on the whole, everyone's already using Google. It's annoying to have to go and go to another thing and then get in the habit of using it. Yes, Friendster and all that existed, but maybe they were a little bit before their time. Yes, maybe Facebook was a little bit better, but there also is timing for these things. Wave was actually an awesome product that was ahead of its time. Google Plus, not awesome. And so the things I get to say now that I don't work for Google. I think, and then once you have Facebook, for example, particularly with social networks, network effects really do come into play, right? And that is where you do, I do get a little bit worried sometimes when all of a sudden you have Facebook.
It's feeding back.
When you have Facebook that also owns, say, Instagram, that can do all kinds of optimizations between those two apps to push people to the app, to in some cases cannibalize growth of one thing to push to the other. Like there's all kinds of data science that happens around that to kind of keep you locked into that ecosystem, which again, all's fair in competition, but I think it's a little worrisome. Having said that, I don't think it's like a finished game. I don't think search is a finished game. I do think someone could come along. It would have to be something fundamentally different that would pique people's interest enough to get them there, because I think if you do something similar as Bing did, I think it is really hard to switch.